Hi and welcome to Ask GMBN Tech. This is the workshop style Q&A clinic. You ask us mountain bike tech questions, like how to fix your bike, stuff like that. Hopefully we can help you out. Get your questions in those comments underneath. Use that hashtag Ask GMBN Tech and well, fire away. We'll see what we pick out for next week's show. So first up this week comes from Random Mountain Biker. He says, just wondering if you can fit a 27.5 by 2.3 tyre on a 27.5 by 2.2 rim. Do you mean you've previously had a 2.2 tyre and you want to upgrade to a slightly bigger tyre? If that's the case, then yes, you'll be absolutely fine. So pretty much you can get away with most tyre sizes on most rims, excluding fat tyres and plus size tyres out of the equation here. Now, once upon a time, most mountain bike rims external size would have been around 25mm, but they're up to about 30mm internally these days. Now, the bigger the rim, the bigger the tyre volume you can achieve and the bigger tyre you're going to get on there. It gives the tyre the correct amount of support. So you don't want to go for too big a tyre with too smaller a rim. Effectively, you'll get that sort of light bulb effect and you'll round the corners of the tyre there. So as we're starting to see wider rims now, if you want to put a narrower tyre on that rim, again, you can have the opposite effect. You can actually square it off a little bit too much and get those shoulders a little bit too angular, which although is great for cutting in on turns, you don't have a nice transition between the top patch of the tyre to the midway to that shoulder. It can feel a bit of an odd tyre to ride. So accordingly, manufacturers like Maxxis, good example, are offering tyres which they call wide trail. Now, it's not reflective of the size of the tyre, it just means the tyre tread and the carcass has been designed to run a wide rim to offer the support. But in your case, then yes, you'll be absolutely fine going up that much. You wouldn't want to go as far as, say, a 2.5 tyre, I think, judging by the fact that your rim supports the 2.2, but you should be fine with the 2.3 on there. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, next up is from Rune VW. Hey Doddy, how much grease or oil do you need in a freehub? Well, depends on what you're using it for and depends on how often you plan on greasing it and servicing it. I always prefer to use an oil over a grease, and the reason being for this, I like it to run as slick and as smooth as possible, and I do tend to maintain things a bit more frequently, but I'm well aware that that's not exactly normal for most people. Most people just want to fix something, make it work and get on with the riding. So in which case you want to use a very thin grease. Now DT, hold on a second, DT make a grease called special grease, and it's specifically designed for using on the internal components of hubs, not bearings, for using on the pulls and on the ratchets. The internal gubbins basically make your hub work. This stuff is nice and thin, it does the job, it makes the stuff nice and movable. Now you don't want to be using a nice thick grease on the inside, or I should say a horrible thick grease on the inside, because the aim of putting grease on the pulls and stuff is not just to repel water from there, it's to aid their movement. Yeah, so by putting a thick grease, you're actually hindering the movement, and you can make things worse. So get yourself a thin grease. You could get a specialist grease like this, or you could get something perhaps Teflon based, something like that. There's a number of different style greases on the market. Suspension grease works really well on the inside of hubs. It's extremely slippery, it's very thin, and it does stay in place pretty well. But don't use anything too thick. Now, if you're going to use oil, you want to use something like a thick, wet lube. Don't want to use dry lube, it's almost, well, it's not really going to do anything in there. A thick lube is best used for this. Now, I'm pretty sure the Mavic, I used to have some somewhere, I've probably used it up now, used to make a dedicated freehub oil. Now, you can get those if you look around from various different brands on the market. It's a very specialist product, tends to only be made by the manufacturers of hubs. But if you find some, it will be brilliant stuff. So it is kind of worth having a look if you want the ultimate and just something that rolls extremely fast there. That's about all you need to know. Just really take care, especially if your hub has pulls on the inside as opposed to ratchets. The ratchets, because they have springs either on one side or both sides, they are always semi-engaged, so they can't slip. Whereas the pulls, if you put massively huge amounts of thick grease in there, for example, they've only got tiny little springs that push them back into place. And sometimes you can see them stick down. If they stick down, they're not going to give you that engagement and they can slip. You can hear that bang noise sometimes, like a bit of a crack. That sometimes happens if they slip, so you don't want that to happen. It can be painful and it can damage your hub as well. Okay, next up from LSJ. I'm wanting to raise the front end of my bike and I really want to know what is the difference between more spacers versus higher rise bars and how each will affect the feel of the bike. Okay, well, this does depend as well on your head angle on your bike, but just for example, Let's say you've got a 64-degree head angle, pretty slack, like my Canyon Spectral, that's about 64.5. Here's a shot of it on screen from my bike check recently. Now, if you look at this picture here, and if you imagine, the more stem spaces you put under that stem, the closer towards you the stem's going to get. So effectively, you're shortening that top tube length on the bike, and accordingly, you're shortening your reach, which is effectively the distance from your feet to the handlebars. I mean, it's a bit more to it than that, but that's really what the reach takes into account there. So your position when you're stood up, the closer to that stem, closer the stem gets to you by putting more spaces under it, the closer the bar's going to get to you. So yes, it comes up, but it also comes back slightly. So if you want your bike to feel the longest, slamming the stem is best, but that's not always the best for your riding position. Now with the bars, you can just get a higher rise bar and a lower rise bar, which doesn't change anything really, except for the height of your bars. But that is according to where you roll the bars. So you can have a few different iterations here. Now I like a high rise bar, and I like to roll my bars slightly forwards. Always have done, regardless of the fact it does effectively, I guess, make your reach slightly longer. But I've always liked the position. I think from when I used to ride a bit of trials and used to pretend I was Martin Ashton back in the day and go and ride up and down curbs all the time. And I've always loved that riding position. So I've always maintained a fairly high rise bar and rolling it forwards. But certain bikes need a higher front end than others. For example, if your bike has extremely long chainstays or a longer back end on there, you may well need to have a higher bar or a shorter cockpit there in order to make it easy enough to get the front end up. The same could be said for a bike with an overly long front end. If your front end is really low at the handlebars and the cockpit, great for weighting that front wheel for loads of traction, not so good for popping the front wheel up. So it's all about trying to balance those things. In an ideal world, you'd go for a mid-range bar, as in height, perhaps 20mm, something like that, and just a couple of spaces, and sort of you can fine-tune your position a bit more then. There you go, hopefully that answers that question. Okay, next one is from William Ramirez Watson. I live at sea level. When I ride at higher elevations, 2,000 to 3,000 metres, should I adjust my shock pressure and tyre pressure? Okay, so I've never known this to be a problem with forks and shocks, but tyre pressure, you can have an effect, but I think it's more to do with temperature than anything else. So I'm pretty sure it's plus or minus 10 degrees in Fahrenheit is plus or minus 2% difference in your tyre pressure. So this will make a huge difference on low volume but high pressure tyres, like road tyres, for example, on a road bike like 23C tyre or something. On a mountain bike, it will make a difference, but a little less so. You know, you might be talking a couple of PSI here and there, depending on the size and the volume of your tyre and what you're running in there. But check your tyre pressure from time to time. I normally carry one of these when I go riding. This one's a Topeak digital tyre gauge, but you can get analog ones. It's just a dial on there, and they tend to be much more accurate than pumps. They only have to do that job. Pumps get knocked around all the time, and sometimes the temperature gauge, the pressure gauges on pumps cannot read quite as accurately as one of these. So like I said, there's various different types. I like the digital one because there's no faffing, it just tells me exactly what I'm running in there. And it's really good to learn from as well. You start finding what tyre pressures really work for you and you'll be quite surprised. So apparently Dave Garland used to mess with tyre pressures quite a lot with riders like Danny Hart, even to the extent that, you know, after an amount of runs in hot conditions, you'd have to alter tyre pressure or factor in the fact on certain courses at a certain altitude and certain temperature, the tyre pressure could be dramatically different by the time the rider gets to the bottom. So I had to decide where the rider was going to need the softer tyre pressure and the harder pressure more, whether it is at the top or at the bottom, and sort of take that into account. But pretty interesting stuff, that. And in fact, I'd like to actually speak to a few World Cup style mechanics, in particular downhill mechanics, on exactly this sort of setup. Like, how much does the bike change in feel from the top of the course to the bottom of the course? Because there's so many different factors. Of course, if there was any air or anything wrong with the brakes, you get brake fade, things like that. You can also get stuff with the suspension, where, you know, your suspension might be packing down, or it might be overheating slightly, and you get inconsistency in the damping. It's kind of interesting stuff. I'd like to find out a bit more myself. That's very specialist, so for the downhill guys. So definitely need to speak to some of those mechanics. Next up's from Bill Beck 123, or Bib 123 even. What do you think is a better upgrade on a $500 bike? 3x9 to 1x12. So that's taking your 3 chain rings at the front and 9 at the back, and taking 2 of them off the front, leaving 1, and adding some at the rear to make it a 1x12. Or coil to air fork, or normal to telescopic seat post, or something else. What would make the most difference? Okay, so, well, you're on a budget, and actually that's almost irrelevant here. This should be the same for anyone. So when it comes to upgrading parts on your bike, do consider what are consumable parts on a bike first. So there are consumable parts which are parts that wear out as you're using them. Your tyres are consumable. There's no way you would just go and buy a new tyre if your tyre has life on it. It's pointless. Unless that tyre is completely inappropriate for where you ride, in which case you'd probably want to change it for a different pattern. But what you really want to do to maximise on your money is wait until the tyre's completely worn out and it's had it. Then, at that point, you would have a choice of whether you want to spend a bit more money and upgrade the tyre or get something like for like. Now, this is the same and probably more important with your transmissions. If your gears are working on there, your chain is not worn and stretched, your chainrings aren't worn and stretched, worn out and pitted or anything like that, any damage to them, not pitted, but you know what I mean, there's no point replacing the stuff. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. People go crazy trying to be like, oh, I've only got 11 speed on the back, I must have 12. Chill out, don't worry about it. It's going to wear out sooner or later, so at that point, worry about upgrading it then. So my better suggestion would be just start squirreling away a bit of money here and there. Even a tiny amount of money will help, you know, depending on what you're able to afford. And then by the time these components wear out, you've got a bit of a fund already ready there to delve into to help you upgrade. So don't change your gears, your transmission out, just wait. So a dropper post, undoubtedly, is one of the best things for being able to change the way that you're capable to ride a bike on various terrain, because it will improve your confidence, it gets the saddle out of the way, you can lower your centre of gravity. There's so many good things about a drop post, but they are expensive. Now, if you're not in a hurry and you can deal without the convenience, there's nothing wrong with the quick release lever. Yep, all right, you're going to have to stop your riding and you have to lower your seat each time you want to negotiate a bit of terrain like that, but it's nearly free by comparison. So it's definitely worth considering these things. Don't forget, upgrades, you're spending more money to achieve something, okay? So you don't always need to do that. But, you know, if it's purely about making your bike ride better off-road, then I think a dropper post is one of those things. And the advantage of a dropper post, depending on what size your frame is, if you have a frame that's got a common seat post size, like 30.9 or 31.8, you have the advantage of being able to take that post and put it onto your next bike when you eventually sort of decide to upgrade that bike. That's if you look after it, of course, the seat post on the bike. Otherwise, if it's a bit knackered by the time you come to sell the bike, it might not be worth it. But you can move components between bikes. That's not a consumable component. That's something you can look after and service. Whereas your transmission, like I said, you're going to wear it out literally as you ride. So wait until it's worn out before you replace it. Next up, from Hanang. Why do front axles, why are they wider, why are they bigger than the rear? The rear needs to be stronger, doesn't it? Well, I think it's all about the bracing angle here. So you think of the rear end on a bike, it's much wider, as wide as 157 millimeters on some bikes. Because it's so wide, you get the strength from the width, so accordingly you can have a slightly thinner axle. And also you just don't need to add additional weight. There's so much stuff going on at the back. Whereas at the front, it's much narrower, so you have less of a bracing angle to get the strength and the rigidity needed. So the front axle tends to be a bit bigger. We're only talking 15mm and 12mm. It's not much, but it does make a difference. I mean, there used to be 20mm, but really, other than on downhill bikes, it was pretty much seen that it wasn't necessary. There wasn't so much of a difference on a single crown fork of that nature. It wasn't stiff enough to warrant the difference. So yeah, 15 and 12, and that's pretty much why. Okay, next question is from Spuddo. Interesting name. Do you think the future of dropper posts will be a version where you can move them up and down purely via the remote without having to push it down physically? Yeah, almost certainly. So this is one of the reasons dropper posts aren't completely, you're not seeing them on all cross-country race bikes. If you're watching like the XCO, the Red Bull World Cup, the thing with using a dropper post, there's two negative sides to this for those cross-country races. One of them, actually, in fact, it's three. One of them is the weight. The second factor is by using a dropper post and getting the saddle out of the way, riders are almost led into a bit of a false sense of security because you can ride the bike much faster. Now, whilst this is great, you can ride the bike faster, more stability and more security, confidence and safety and stuff. The downside of that is the componentry on those bikes is incredibly lightweight. So arguably, you could override the components on there. You could slash a tyre a bit easier or perhaps damage a wheel, things like that. So, you know, whilst dropper posts are brilliant as a safety item, in a race situation where you're really, really hammering it, sometimes by putting a drop post down, you would sacrifice other parts on a bike. That's not the case, of course, with all the field. That's just a theory for some riders out there that we've heard say this. Yeah, and of course there's the final one, which I'm going to get to here, is the fact that using a dropper post uses more energy. I've heard quite a lot of cross-country racers say they don't choose to use them because of the fact that the constant squatting as you're riding a bike uses more energy. Now, I know a lot of you, and I actually question this as well, thinking like, really, how much energy does that actually use? But the fact is, when you're in a cross-country race, you're literally redlining the entire time. So anything that uses additional energy can't be a good thing. Those guys and girls are literally riding on the limit. They're in the red zone the whole race, you know, above threshold sort of thing. So they need all the help they can get, which is why the BMC seat post is such a cool thing. So firstly, they've got a post that's integrated into the frame. This makes it very light because it's not two tubes inside another tube. It simplifies the whole system, the way it works. It's an integrated dropper post design. It looks really good. In fact, it looks better than any other dropper post because it doesn't look like a dropper post. It looks so clean and tidy. That for me is like the single best thing about it. But they also have a new race version. Now I think it's called Auto Drop or something like that. And there's a little clip just flying up on screen. This is on YouTube. I'm going to put the link to it in the description underneath. It's on a BMC page. And they've developed an auto drop post. Now it does take a little chamber in there that you have to charge with air. It doesn't say how long it lasts or anything. It's still in a prototyping stage by the looks of it. But racers have been using this. I'm pretty sure like Jordan Saru used it at the World Champs where he won. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was on his bike, this system. So how cool is that? You can ride along, press the button, and it gets out your way, and you can press it again, and it comes back up. That is what racers want, and I do think that that will be the future with dropper post. It's just you need to master the system because this one that BMC have developed will obviously have a limited amount of use because of the fact you've got to pump it up to make it work. However, I think that they will be coming, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And I can't wait to try dropper post that self-drops. I think that is just such a good idea, really good, and massive props to BMC, all the design team there for A, making something that looks so sleek, and B, really giving the racers something that they can really maximise and use. I think that's great. Next up from Oscar. Doddy, modern geometry in cross country. We have a problem with since a few years due to conservative approach in frame design. Do you think that projects like the NS sign-in with a 67-degree head angle will be a start point for others to go with more progressive geometry as well? And what benefits the athletes can get from such movements? So this is interesting, and actually a lot of what I'm going to say here is probably similar to the last question. So you've got to think that if you have an aggressive cross-country bike, if it was slacker at the front end and longer at the front end, you had wider bars and all these things on there, they're really going to sort of promote you to ride the bike much harder. And there's always going to be a compromise here. So the weight is going to be one of those things. When you ride a bike harder, you need stiffer wheels. Stiffer wheels tend to be stronger, heavier wheels. You're going to need sturdier tyres. You might need inserts on it. These are all the things that the cross-country riders turn around. Now, the real key on a cross-country bike is keeping the weight down, keeping that rotational weight down, because after all, that is all energy that they're constantly powering around. As soon as it adds a little bit more weight, you could argue, yeah, all right, the riders could get stronger or could get fitter and adapt to it. But then suddenly you'll enter the realm of like the trail market. Let's not forget the trail bikes essentially were just cross-country bikes and they're beefed up a bit to make them better for all-day use. Now the breakdown here on wheel travel can be a bit confusing. So what I would deem as a cross-country bike would be 100 millimeters of travel front and rear, potentially down smaller than that, maybe like 80 millimeters, but certainly no more than 100. Some people are referring to this new category of downcountry, which would essentially be a cross-country bike with a fraction more travel on it. Perhaps a 120 fork, maybe 110, up to 120 on the back, no more than that. Any more than that and it becomes a trail bike. So this downcountry category really is just a glorified cross-country bike. It's a marketing term, okay? So the bikes aren't really much different to a regular cross-country bike, just a bigger fork and maybe a bit more travel on the shock. Move that one aside. The trail bike really was like every man or every woman's bike. So these things had like 120 to 130 mil travel front and rear. And they were nice and light, not as light as a cross-country bike, but far lighter than sort of like all mountain bikes, which we know as enduro bikes these days. and they're probably the most suitable bikes for most people, but the categories are kind of just blurring a little bit now. You know, you've got down country stepping in here, and of course you've got enduro racing, super enduro. There's just a whole plethora of different things out there. But simply put, if you put wild geometry on a cross-country bike, you're going to ride it too hard for the capabilities of it, and accordingly you're going to need stronger, tougher and heavier equipment on there. So I'm not sure how much advantage there is. I mean, I would like to ride a cross-country bike. I mean, the Canyon I've got has got 480 reach, and although the bike fits me on paper, if it was a trail bike, it would be far too small for me. It fits me in the terms of a cross-country bike. I wouldn't like it to be any slacker, to be honest. I think it feels really responsive. I might like the seat angle to be a little steeper on there. Nothing crazy. I think it's got 74 on there, so I might say 75 and a half. Doesn't need to be crazy on there, and I'd like a little bit more on the front end of the bike. I'm currently running an 80mm stem. I think if I was running a 60mm stem on there, that would almost be a perfect bike for me. I'm not a cross-country racer, so I'm not looking for the things a cross-country racer is. I'm not looking for a down-country style bike. I like the cross-country bikes. I just want the fit to be a little bit bigger. These sort of bikes need their responsiveness. Yeah, all right, you could go back to 67 degrees, but any slacker than that, and I think you're risking ruining what you can actually achieve on the bike. Now, it's an interesting concept. I know some brands out there are starting to push things a bit. Mondraker's got a quite aggressive cross-country bike, and I'm sure there will be some other development, but there's definitely going to be a price to pay with that, I think, in terms of the actual weight of the bikes. You can't have a bike that's long, stiff, aggressive, and light. You just can't have all of those things together without having an insanely priced bike, or having some kind of sacrifice somewhere. Well, that's my theory on it. And actually, if anyone's got any other sort of feedback on that, let us know in the comments, because I like a long bike, and it makes sense to me to have a long slack bike, but sometimes it's just not always appropriate. Next up, last question from the Aviator. Doddy, do you think in the future they'll introduce wireless braking, like electronic style braking? Oh, God, I hope not. Can you imagine how terrifying that would be, like fly-by-wire? Right, so the camera I'm filming this on is technically fly-by-wire. So it's a mirrorless camera on there. It's not like a DSLR, work a bit differently. And it's got manual focus on there, it's got autofocus, it's got those things, but the autofocus on there is actually fly-by-wire. So you're not physically turning something that opens the aperture, you're turning something that tells the sensor to open the aperture. So can you imagine something like that with braking? I can't. Now you do get sort of fly-by-wire throttles and stuff on cars. I'd imagine brakes probably do exist. I'm pretty sure they've experimented, or they do use them in stuff like Formula One. But that's a different sort of realm of tech. I don't think I could ever trust a wireless, like a brake with no brake hose, brake line, brake cable, anything like that. You need a physical thing there. And even if you think about hydraulics too much, as opposed to literally a steel cable pulling a caliper and making it work, you can even get freaked out by hydraulics, I think, if you look into it too much. What does everyone else think? Am I alone in thinking that wireless brakes is a terrifying idea? I'm not suggesting it's a terrible idea, just it's so scary. You'd have to really convince me to want to try a pair. The only thing that I could see as a massive benefit would be how they look, just with no hoses, no cables, no nothing. Because I love the look of what SRAM have done with the access system. So there's definitely food for thought, and I'm sure that someone is going to develop them, and they'll appear at some point, but I really hope not. Well, that's the end of this week's Ask GMBN Tech. Hopefully you enjoyed the questions, and hopefully you learned something. Let us know what you thought in those comments. Get your questions in for next week's show, and we'll see you soon. Take care. See you later.